Hi, my name's Nick Rains from Leica Camera Australia. In this video, we're going to be talking about the Leica V-Lux 5. I'll show you some pictures and also a couple of little tips I've found to make the camera work that much better. So this is the V-Lux 5. This is what they call a crossover camera. So it's halfway between the higher end interchangeable lens cameras like the SL2 and the CL and at the other end of the scale, the little compacts. So it's got a built-in lens, but it's not just any old built-in lens. This is a 25 to 400 millimeter lens, and that's in 35 millimeter equivalent terms. So the numbers on here have been converted because it's not a full frame sensor. 25 millimeters is pretty wide angle, like genuinely wide angle, useful wide angle, and 400 millimeters is astonishing. And if you look at the specs on the front of the lens here, it says f2.8 to f4. So at 400 millimeters, and I'll wind that out, at 400 millimeters, that's an f4 lens. 400 f4, think about it. You pay an astonishing amount of money for one of those lenses from other camera manufacturers. This is built into the camera and it ain't no slouch either. I'm very impressed with the quality of this lens at f4. In fact, without putting it on the test bench, I've found that I got sharper pictures at f4 than I did at the other f-stops. So at the long end, shooting wide open is probably the go. Now, the other thing about this camera, which I really like, and it's something that I would prefer was on other cameras too, is this tilt screen on the back. I just love having a tilt screen because when I do video, it means I don't have to plug in an external monitor, and that means I don't have to shoot with the camera to my eye, which is, it might sound like a small thing, but it's not really. Being able to shoot on a tripod, so you're sort of filming like this, is just so much easier. It really is. You've got all the information there. It also means you can shoot low without having to grovel on the ground too much, or high, or whatever. And I've got a couple of pictures I'll show you where I was using that screen to great effect. It's also extremely customizable. There's a lot of custom buttons on the back, and there are some custom functions on the menu screen as well. So you can set the camera up to do exactly what you want it to do. Normal modes, it's got some of the fancy modes which I never use, sport and lightning and I don't know, whatever they call them. I just never even look at those. I'm interested in PASM, program, aperture priority, shutter priority and manual. That's what I use for all my cameras. They all come down to those modes anyway, all the fancy modes. They all do much the same thing, just in a slightly different way, but you always get to the same point. So for me, aperture priority and manual are my two go-to modes, and they're here as well. All right, well, let me show you some pictures. I was fortunate enough to have one of the early models when it was first released, and I took it to the Kimberley with me on an assignment. I didn't have access to the raw processing software because it hadn't been released yet. So bear in mind that the pictures I'll show you coming up right now are all JPEGs straight out of camera. I don't normally shoot JPEGs, I shoot raw pictures, but I really wasn't able to in this particular circumstance. So I thought, well, let's just try and see how good the JPEGs can be. And some of the pictures that I'll show you, I have as prints in the Leica store in Melbourne and in Sydney as A3 plus prints. So that's a pretty respectable size print, and they look really good. So no slouch, this camera. Okay, well, let's just have a look at some pictures, and then when I've done that, I'm going to come back. I'm not going to go through all of the menus and all of the options. We would be here all day. What I'm going to do is show you how I've just made a couple of adjustments in the menus just to change how the controls work so that the camera works so much better for me. Now, you may have your own ways of working, but I'll explain why and I'll show you how I've done that, and then you can make your own mind up about it. All right, let's have a look at some pictures. You may be wondering why I'm showing you a picture of a man in a high-vis vest with a hard hat on the dock, in fact. Well, let me show you the next picture. This is me leaving the docks in Broome, and it's not a particularly good photograph. This is me looking out of my balcony on the ship as we headed out. But what I wanted to do, and this was the first time I'd actually used the camera quite literally, I'd just taken it out of the box, is to see the zoom range. So this is 25 millimeters and this is 400 millimeters taken from the same spot. I think that's pretty impressive. And look at the text. It says the name of the company there, and you can read This is Rich. This guy's name is Rich. I can read the name on his shirt. I think that's quite amazing. So 400 millimeters at f4 and 24 millimeters at f8, all handheld. So just wanted to make that point that the lens in this camera is astonishingly versatile. Then, of course, we see a lot of whales on these trips. This is, again, the Kimberley coast. This sort of picture is quite tricky to shoot. I did find that using the little flip-out screen was easier than putting the camera to my eye, because think about it, when you put the camera to your eye, you are excluding your peripheral vision. You're just seeing a blocked off version of what the lens is seeing. Whales are not terribly predictable. When you find one that's breaching, it will do its jump down with a big splash, and then you wait to see if it comes up again, and you wait and you wait, and then suddenly there it is, and it's never where you're looking. It's really hard to anticipate. So what I was doing was holding the focus on the same distance as the whale was previously, and then backing off from the camera using the flip out screen to keep my peripheral vision active. And then by scanning well, not quite scanning the horizon, it can't go that far, but you can keep your eyes open. And as soon as you see the whale start to emerge in a split second, you can move the camera quickly. And I'm not even bothering about whether the camera's level or even framed properly. I'm just shooting a burst of pictures, doing my best to center that whale in the middle of the picture. I'm just doing my best. If you don't do it that way, you will lose so many pictures, and then I will crop it later. So this is actually only cropped about 30%. It's quite a long way away. So it's the only way I found to get consistent results is to keep that eye away from the camera, so you've got some peripheral vision, hold the focus, and then swing the camera around and shoot a burst at 4 or 5, 6 frames a second, whatever the camera will do. I can shoot panoramas with this camera. This is the Rowley Shoals. No, sorry, not Rowley Shoals. This is Montgomery Reef, which emerges at low tide, and you get these horizontal waterfalls. So this is a stitched panorama with some of our guests with us in the Zodiac. And this is me with my SL2 shooting other stuff. So this picture wasn't taken by me, this was taken by my wife, who comes along on these trips and shoots the B-roll stuff. And she just grabbed this one of me. Actually, I look quite slim there, that's quite nice, very flattering. And then just usual pictures, starfish on the beach, same place. This is up at Montgomery Reef again, that nice evening light. So this is quite a big starfish, so this isn't really a close-up picture, but the camera will focus quite close for those little detail images. Back of the ship as we headed out with that nice sunset, just a bit of, these are the sorts of pictures that the company that we were sailing with like for their brochures. So they like to show parts of the ship, and they like to show the evening light and all sorts of things, all the things that the guests are going to experience on board. So they're all useful pictures. But I put this one in because it's shot at quite high ISO in that twilight. You can see the lights on. This is a 1600 ISO shot, and it's very clean. Looking down over the side, the ship has underwater lighting, which makes it look really cool. So when these two Zodiac drivers were just waiting to be hauled on board after a trip, they were backlit by this blue light. So it's a bit weird in that it's artificial light under the water. It's not actually sunlight. So that's, again, a 3200 ISO shot, I believe, and still looking pretty clean. Part of the same sequence. This is what happens to those Zodiacs when they get winched aboard, and you can see we're very late into the twilight here, and I just enjoyed the reflection of the colours on the side of the ship and the profile of the Zodiac being winched ashore. This is a float plane coming into near Talbot Bay, where the horizontal waterfalls exist. There's a very narrow part of the rocks where there's a little tiny gap, and the tide goes in and comes out, obviously twice a day, and it comes through in this massive surge of water, and it's quite exciting to see. You can go through it in a high-speed boat, and I don't know what the speed is, but it comes through that gap at, well, our Zodiacs couldn't go through. They were going backwards, and they were going along at about 15 or 20 knots, so that'll give you an idea of the flow. But I was trying the tracking focus here. So this is the 400mm setting with follow focus tracking set. And as that plane came into land, it held the focus quite neatly. And I got a sequence of about a dozen pictures, which were each perfectly focused. Did a helicopter ride up to Mitchell Plateau to Mitchell Falls, and this is out of the side of a Jet Ranger, a Long Ranger, I believe, with no doors on, so being buffeted by the wind, and the stabilizer did a good job. This is Porosus Creek, where you get a lot of saltwater crocodiles, and I just enjoyed the patterns of the mangroves and that ridiculously milky blue water which you get up there at this time of tide. It's high tide, as you can see. Another part of the Kimberley, there's some really good rock art, and I mentioned before the idea of using the tilt-out screen. I could lie on the ground and I didn't have to lie on my back and look up. I could actually lie on the ground and use the screen horizontally, but with the camera pointing straight up. So this is actually the roof of a small cave, not a wall, and that's quite hard to get at with most cameras when you've got to put your eye to the viewfinder to focus it. So I could use the tilt out screen and rotate it. It made my life a lot easier. Same with this one. This looks to me like a sperm whale, which is quite astonishing to find that up there. Beautiful, beautiful rock art up in the Kimberley. This is a bit more dramatic, going down King George Gorge towards King George Falls. Very backlit, as you can see. The sun's picking up the spray off the Zodiac quite nicely. Again, a 400mm shot. Very, very useful having that reach. I don't have that length on my SL2. I've got the 90 to 280, but there's quite a difference between 280 and 400 mils. So it's nice to have that extra pull with the telephoto lens. Then, of course, you've got the crocodiles up there. This is a 4.5-meter saltwater crocodile. The reflection on the water behind is the rocks, the rock walls of the same gorge that in the previous picture, illuminated by the sun. And the croc himself is in the sun as well. And again, having a 400mm lens when you have crocodiles to see is probably a really good move, because you really don't want to get very close to these guys. And then that head-on compression, which always makes them look, I think, a lot bigger. You can see the bulk of the body, and just look at how his eyes stand out, that yellow reptilian look. Fantastic. But again, you really don't want to go close to these guys. There's a couple of sets of controls here that I'd like to customize and give the camera a slightly better functionality. A little bit depends on how you like working, but let me just show you how I like to control a camera like this. First of all, usually this shutter button is your focusing button as well as your shutter release button. I prefer a camera to have what's known as rear button focus, and not many cameras allow you to really easily set that. There's some do, some don't, and you'd have to look deep into the menus to find out. Same with this camera, you've got to look deep into the menus, but let me just show you how to do it. First of all, when you are in autofocus mode, which is on this little control on the back here, see it says AFS, that's autofocus. If you move this to manual focus, like that, you get, no surprise, manual focus. And that now means that this ring here is set to, when you turn it, it should magnify the center section of the picture, and you can see that little blue haze coming over the subject when it's sharp. You should be able to see that. I'm just looking at my keyboard here. I don't have anything particularly interesting in the room to point the camera at, but this will do, make the point. So that's manual focus, but also, and this is not at all obvious, when you press this button here, you also get on-demand autofocus. So by setting the camera to manual focus, you get on-demand autofocus on this button here, as well as the opportunity to shoot in manual mode and focus critically, which is great for video, for instance, because you really don't want autofocus in video, because sometimes it can make things worse, and it certainly creates more problems than it solves in many cases. And this focusing ring here, I've got to say, is actually beautifully smooth. Some of the lower end cameras have a very, very fiddly way to set the focus, and this one is extremely well connected to that focus point. It's really nice. So manual focus here gives you on-demand autofocus on that little button in the middle of the switch, and removes focus from the shutter button here. The other thing I want to change is I like to use auto exposure, and I use aperture priority almost all the time. But I also use exposure compensation on top of that, and you do have a custom button here, function 4, which by default has that little plus and minus symbol next to it. And on the back of the camera, if I press that, it takes us to the plus and minus or exposure compensation, and you can see the histogram going up and down as well. That means one press, two presses, but you can set this dial to be already on exposure compensation. And if I go into the menus and I want the tool, this is the tools, third one down, tools, operation, and in there, dial set down at the bottom, hopefully you can see that okay, dial set. And then the third one down allows you to change the back dial to exposure compensation. So that there, that back dial. The top one is the front dial. That's that one. So if you prefer it to be there, that's okay. I prefer it to be on the back. So now when I come out of those menus, when I dial this dial here, you see, I get straight to exposure compensation. You can see that histogram moving, and you can see the yellow exposure compensation moving. So it's dedicated now. This dial here is my aperture, which you can see changing here. That's the yellow one. Incidentally, anything that's yellow is the one that you're changing at the moment. Because I'm in aperture priority, the shutter speed here is being picked by the camera. I'm choosing the aperture, and then I'm overriding it with exposure compensation, which is a nice, elegant way of working. There's also a very neat way of judging your exposure. Well, let's say two neat ways of doing it. First of all, you've got your histogram here, but you've also got this exposure overlay called zebra stripes, which if I go into the menu now and come down to the next page, which is page 5 here, you've got the focus peaking, which I showed you before, that's that blue haze. You've got the histogram, which is already turned on, and if yours is turned off, maybe turn it on. But the one I want to show you here is zebra pattern. And what this does is it allows you to set, if I hit the set button and then go set again, it allows you to choose two different zebra patterns. One is triggered at 80%, and one is triggered at 100%. And the 100% is effectively an overexposure warning highlight. The 80% one gives you the zebra stripes over anything that's 80% bright or more, in the sense that 1 or 0 is black and 100 is white, or completely white. So this is useful for pegging skin tones, and you can change this. So I can change that to a different percentage, and you may decide that 70% is where you want your skin tones. I find 80 works pretty well. And when that's set, now I'm going to choose this one just for illustration, but it's exactly the same process. It just gives you two options. When you choose this one, and whoops, that's right, 100%, come out of there and out of there. When I choose exposure compensation, now hopefully it won't overexpose on this preview. Let me just get that set. So I'm going to dial in some exposure compensation, and as that gets to overexpose, can you see here, we're starting to get like there it is. You can see that reasonably clearly. That's a zebra stripe, those diagonal lines. And as I go up another click, can you see those lines extending? And again, and that's showing me which parts of the picture are at 100% or more. So it's an overexposure. And if I go a long way, you'll see it's almost the whole picture. Now that could be for either skin tones at 80% or overexposure warning at 100%. So the way I work is I set that so it just disappears, maybe there, just about there. And that I know is a perfectly correct exposure. And you'll see at the bottom, my exposure compensation is set to plus 2/3. I don't really care what that is, as long as my zebra stripes are in just the right position. That means that when you're shooting, all you've really got to do is pick your aperture, let the camera choose your shutter speed, make sure the shutter speed's appropriate for whatever you're shooting, and then dial a little bit of plus, and it usually is a bit of plus, to make sure that your highlights are just teetering on the edge of white, and then come back a third of a stop, and that will give you a perfect exposure every single time. It's very elegant, very quick, and once you've got the hang of it, you'll wonder how you ever worked before. So there's just a couple of little hints about how the camera can be customized to work better for you. Obviously, there are a lot more custom buttons you can use, and you can have this camera set up in so many different ways. But those are the two things that I do to most of my cameras, and in this case, the V-Lux, it makes the camera go from something that's reasonably easy to use to something that's really, really professional in the way it works. So that works pretty good. I'm happy with that. So that's not so much of an overview of the camera, that's more me just showing you some of the little tiny tweaks that you can do with this camera. Remember, it's very, very customizable. And if you look at the manual, shock horror, you may find some other things that you can do to make the camera work for you even better. My name is Nick Rains. Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed this, maybe consider subscribing to our channel so you'll find out about new videos as I make them. Goodbye for now.